The following program is a UW-TV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello and welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Marcia Alvar. What is the typical American family, and how different is it today than it was at the turn of the century? Stephanie Coontz says that the answers to those questions might surprise us because of the enormous body of mythology about the family that we've come to accept as fact. Coontz teaches at Evergreen State College and is a leading authority on family issues. Her newest book on the subject is The Way We Never Were, American Families and the Nostalgia Trap. Welcome to Upon Reflection.
Thank you.
We certainly have heard a lot in recent years about the breakdown of the family and the erosion of family values. How different is today's family, and is it imperiled?
Well, there are obviously some big differences. Certainly the divorce rate is higher than it's ever been, although divorce has been building steadily. It didn't come just as a surprise. America has had the highest divorce rate in the world since 1889. On the other hand, despite the high divorce rate, a couple that marries today has a better chance of celebrating their 40th anniversary than any other time in American history because of the fall in mortality rates. Blended families, most people think of them as new, but again, because of death rates, blended families of the 90s would look far more familiar to colonial Americans than the 1950s families would. I think as a historian, I find what's most difficult about talk about the family is that people make these sweeping generalizations about it's getting better or it's getting worse, and they don't think about the trade-offs. And that prevents us from having a really good discussion of what things have been gains and what things have been losses.
Why do you think there's been so much concern, so much attention on the basic health of the family?
Well, I think it's obviously a very important institution, and that is the place where we feel and experience social crises in the most personal form. Whenever there are big changes in our economic, social, and political institutions, and as we've seen, there has been a breakdown of commitments and obligations and traditional ways of reproducing ourselves, we feel it in the family. We experience it as a family crisis. Then it's very tempting for politicians and economic elites to take off on that and say, well, if only you would organize your families differently, if only you would live like those 1950s sitcoms, we wouldn't have any economic and political crisis. And that's where the nostalgia turns into a real trap and a real way of beating up on people.
Is the concern about the family in and of itself anything new, or have there always been periods where there's been concern about the family and its possible breakdown?
Well, no, in that sense it's not new. The colonial Americans, the first generation that got here, was talking about the collapse of the family and how the new generation coming up was destroying things. But I think that it always intensifies when there are big changes in the economic and political and social system. You had one of those periods back in the switch to wage labor, and then another big one back at the end of the 19th century as America became an urban society. And the same kind of pattern prevailed then. People said, oh, there's a crisis of the family. If immigrants would just organize their families different, we wouldn't have poverty in the cities. If women would just stop pursuing selfish individualism, and therefore they criminalized abortion, which had not previously been criminal, we would have no problem at all. And then I think we had a similar impact in the 1980s as the end of the post-war prosperity came. There was tremendous changes in economic trends and real wages for workers, for political trends, and people again said, all right, this must be a family crisis. And so there was a redoubling of attention to the family.
So the family really is a reflection of the culture and what's going on in the culture at large.
That's right. Absolutely. You can't have shared commitment and obligations in a family if you don't in a community at large.
Now, in your book, you write that when you teach classes, one of the things that you like to do early on is to have students write down a list of images that come to their minds when they hear the phrase traditional family. What are the things that come back to you most often?
Well, it seems to be kind of a combination of Nick at Night reruns, the images of the great families that always had
Donna
those discussions right after, and the wonderful family dinners they used to have with everybody calm and the parents dispensing wise advice. And then there's a little piece of the Waltons thrown in from the 30s, you know, the idea of, oh, there's also a grandparent around. We used to have extended families. Then there's a little piece from Little Women's stories, you know, about when childhood was protected. And if the people are conservative, they also throw in a little bit about colonial days when supposedly a man's home was his castle. And they all get mushed together into this strange image.
Do you then ask them how much those images resemble their own families, their own lives?
Oh, yes. When they start researching their own family lives, it's just amazing how many will begin to reinterpret even things that they had taken for granted. They'll find illegitimate children in their past, alcoholism, abuse, or they'll find that they used to think they had perfect families, and it turns out that the things that really worked for them were rather non-traditional, that it was an aunt or a teacher or somebody else who played a very important role for them.
Does it trouble students when they see that contrast between sort of the Hallmark card version of families and family life as it really is?
For most of them, it relieves them. For most of them, it takes them off the hook.
But they thought, well, we're the only ones.
Yes, because most of them would grow up simultaneously fantasizing that things had been really good and they'd had all of these traditions, and afraid that they were different, that whenever they violated the traditions, they were the only ones doing so. You know, I think the primary reaction to watching those TV reruns is a sense either of guilt for not living up to it yourself, or anger at your parents. Why didn't we live exactly that way?
As you mentioned, so many of these images of the ideal family, you know, mom and pop and the kids and everything being wonderful, came out of the 50s, and particularly out of the sitcoms that people watch. Why are those images so powerful? Why does that decade stand out above all the rest?
Well, it's ironic that it stands out because it was the most untraditional decade in America's history. For the first time in 100 years, the divorce rate fell, the age of marriage fell, the fertility rate increased, women's degree of educational equality with men began to diverge, even though it had been converging for the last 100 years. So it's very ironic that we experience this as a typical and traditional. But I think one of the reasons that the images are so powerful is precisely because they were models, they were fantasies at the time. They were not reality. It was a new idea that the family should be the center of your emotion, and that the nuclear family could be everything to you, and that women could play this perfect role of being sexy wives and at the same time giving mothers, which is one reason they invented tranquilizers in the 50s, by the way. But the point is that all of these sitcoms laid this out as a model precisely because it was a new idea. They said, this is what you should aim for. This is what you should live up for. Look how beautiful it would be if you did that. And so the images were very powerful because they weren't even trying to represent a reality. So from a distance, we look back at them and we say, oh, gee, that must have been reality. How nice it would have been.
Well, as you say, I think Leave It to Beaver is not a documentary. And it seems like it's the coupling of this new philosophy about the family, this philosophy that emerged in the 50s, coupled with this brand new medium that everyone was watching for the first time. So the fact that television became common during that decade must have served as a tremendous potent force for driving this philosophy into individual homes.
Yes, yes. The images were very, very powerful because they were new. They were combined with the fact that we'd just gone through the Depression and World War II with very, very stressful economic situations, family situations. People were
great separation.
Yes, and violence and doubling up and very high divorce rates. And there was a sense that yes, this would be exactly what we want. That made it very powerful. And it was reinforced, I think, in our own minds when we look back. We misinterpret some of the gains of the 50s. First of all, because we homogenize and we think that the white middle class experience was typical. And secondly, because there were things going on that were better than today. For example, real wages were rising. Government subsidies to young families were much, much more generous than they are today.
You said in the book we couldn't afford to go back to the 50s.
No, No, it's really interesting. When people want to go back to the 1950s, what they mean is that women should go back to accepting a second-class citizenship, but they generally have no intention of implementing the kinds of government subsidies to young families and family housing that were also an important part of the package deal that was the 1950s family in reality.
As you mentioned, the image of the family that we've talked about so far really deals only with the white middle class and an idealized version of the white middle class at that. But you devote an entire chapter of your book to black families, and even though those families didn't have those images on television, that doesn't mean that a great many myths didn't grow up about those families as well.
Yes. Well, first of all, anybody who watches the television is going to absorb some of those, so I'm sure that there are myths in all sectors of the population. But perhaps the worst and most destructive thing is that these images of the 1950s families then laid out as normal what was a very class-specific and race-specific experience, and allowed people then, as we saw after the Los Angeles riots just recently, to look around at African Americans or Mexican Americans and say, well, if you would only live like these 1950s family images, then you wouldn't have poverty. You wouldn't have any of these kinds of problems. And that is such a lie, and it's so racist that we end up with images of, for example, the black cocaine users, when in fact your typical crack addict is a white middle-class man in his 40s. This is something you can't get from our contemporary images, and it's part that racism that we find everywhere in discussions about the black family is a very important consequence of the way that we use these 50s images to beat up on everybody.
You also mentioned, you talk about in that same chapter about the birth rate, because there is this predominant image of young black women having an enormous number of children, and that isn't true either.
Right. Contrary to what we tend to think of, the birth rates of unmarried black women have actually fallen since 1970. But because birth rates to married coupled black families have fallen so much faster, it turns out that a higher proportion of black children who are being born into single-parent families. Well, when you put the two together, that then creates a question of, well, what's happening? Why are the birth rates to two-parent families falling so rapidly? And when we ask questions, it turns out that this isn't just a free choice, that they're having fewer children than they would like to have because of the economic crisis of employment facing the black community. And that's a slightly different one than the moralism that you got during this last summer.
You mentioned the economics in the black community, which we've been sort of speaking about as if it's some kind of monolithic entity. How does the fact that particularly in the last decade or so, an enormous gap has appeared in income in the black community, how has that affected the families on either side of that economic spectrum?
Well, that's really important to understand. There's a polarization that's occurred in the black community with college-educated and professional African Americans making some very important gains. But at the same time, high school-educated black Americans or high school dropouts who used to, in the 1950s and 60s, and particularly in the much maligned 60s, had a window of opportunity open up to them through the development of union jobs and job training programs that allowed them to get ahead. All of those things are gone now. You have declining real wages, and the younger sector of the population has been hurt most. And so that sector of the population, of the black population, has been thrown into a kind of poverty, and an extensive long-term kind of poverty that is unprecedented. It's important to remember, though, that this is also happening to white Americans.
It's just a matter of degrees.
Exactly.
But as you said earlier, when economic times are rough, that's when the pressure is most intense on families. So for African Americans who are low-income families, the stress then presumably is greater on them.
Oh, it's tremendous. It's just absolutely unbelievable. We're talking about cities that are like permanent monuments to Hurricane Andrew, where not only are the jobs gone, not only is there poverty, but it's unprecedented, the extent to which that poverty coexists with an absolutely devastated social and economic environment. There are no job networks there at all. There are no transportation systems. There are no social services, except the ones that make things worse. Because of the not in my backyard movements, they can put the drug treatment centers in these same neighborhoods. The result is absolute devastation. And as you implied earlier by your other question, it also hurts middle-class African-American families, because the images that people get about the black family are the images of this extraordinary poverty.
So how do the myths that we have about families, what's the linkage between life as it really is for the families that we've described and public policy? Where do the mythologies play into that? How do they help shape or form our public policy about families?
Well, I think that the mythology is very important and has been used as a real political battering ram in the last few years. I think that this family mythology is the new social Darwinism of the 1990s. In the late 19th century, we had the individual social Darwinism that said if you're poor, it's because of a failure of individual character. In the 80s, they developed this new idea, and we saw it played out very, very clearly during the election campaign and after the Los Angeles riots, that that family structure is the main cause of poverty. Race, class, unemployment, somehow these have all become unimportant. And if people would just get married and not have babies until both are working, then we wouldn't have, and incidentally, I'm quoting a well-known economist in saying that if people would just not get married until they both had a job and not have babies until they both had a job, we would have no poverty problem in America. Well, tell that to the 74,000 workers that GM has announced it's going to lay off. That's nonsense. The main causes of poverty and are unemployment, are job restructuring, are the export of jobs, and are racial imbalances. But in fact, this new mythology of the family says, no, it's all a question of family, and if you have a bad family, that's the cause of poverty. And also there's this hopelessness attached, like all of the talk about crack babies. I think the political impact of it is to let the politicians off the hook, to say, well, of course we can't do anything about them. This is a throwaway generation. They've ruined themselves, and we don't bear any responsibility.
You mentioned generations, and let's look at this institution of the family again through that particular prism, not necessarily just going back to the start of the century and comparing it to now, but let's look at generation by generation and how that has shaped the family. Let's take the baby boom generation as an example.
Well, there are two baby boom generations. One is the initial one that were the activists. A lot of them provided the activists during the civil rights and anti-war movement and the women's movement. They also were a more affluent sector of the population. These are the people who began to initiate a lot of the new sexual mores, new political mores, critiques of old consumerism and of the double standard. They are frequently blamed for having initiated absolutely, the kind of sexuality that you see on television today with shows like Studs and stuff like that. But in fact, a lot of their values were opposed to this kind of sexual exploitation.
So do they have different kinds of families?
I think all families are particularly affected. It's the second wave of the baby boomers, however, the ones who have not had the chance to have the kind of jobs that they expected and to make the use of their education that they expected.
The ones on the tail end of the baby
the ones at the tail end who've had the worst trouble, I think, because what they've done is they've experienced some of the gains and freedoms that were real freedoms and gains in comparison to the repressiveness of family relations and gender roles in the 50s and early 60s, and we tend to forget just how repressive those roles were. They've experienced some of those gains in the context of an economic situation that turns a lot of those gains into much more double-edged sword, like the right to work, becomes now a necessity to work. And for many of these, it's a very confusing, disorienting conjuncture of events and trends.
I'm interested in looking at all of the different parties in families, really of various types, women, men, and children, and how our mythologies about the families have affected each of those parties.
Yes, well, one really important thing to understand is that our old mythology about the family, really all the generalizations we made from the point of view of the male household head. So that when people say, oh, you know, once the family was more stable, at what cost? I mean, people who idealize our past, for example, seem to forget that in Anglo-American law, right up into the 19th century, a man could beat his wife until she was senseless, so long as he didn't use a stick broader than his thumb. That's where our expression, rule of thumb, comes from. Children, we had societies for the prevention of cruelty to animals before we had any protection for children in families. We considered it part of family autonomy to let a parent do whatever they wanted to a child. So in the 20th century, we've seen a restriction of some of the older rights of male household heads, but on the other hand, an expansion of some of the rights, or refuges at least, of women and children. There have been trade-offs this way. But of course, the other side of it is you can't even generalize about this being a loss for men, because many men have found that the removal of the old stereotypes has allowed them to explore nurturing aspects of their personality that they never were able to do before.
It sounds like from that description that you've just given that everybody's actually better off.
No, I wouldn't say that's true. I think there has been a polarization in many ways. There are more, we always talk about deadbeat dads, there are more fathers running out on child support than there were 20 years ago. On the other hand, there are also more fathers spending more time with their kids than there were 20 years ago. And there's also child support. Until the 1920s, a man didn't even have a child support obligation. So there have been gains and there have been losses, and the most important thing is that there are totally new challenges. Take, for example, the aging of our population, and you get all of these people saying, oh, the family is so selfish today, they've abandoned their elders. That is not true. Families were never responsible for taking care of many elders, and particularly they were never responsible, because we didn't have the medical technology, for taking care of elders who lived a long time even though they are handicapped in some way, you know, stroke victims or Alzheimer's, etc. And the result is a tremendous new burden on families, and it's cruel and vicious policy to talk about how families are abandoning their elderly instead of talking about how do we adjust social programs to help families deal with this new challenge.
One of the things you do in your book is you go into very specific examples, and you look at the origins of different phrases, or even the meaning of holidays. And one of the really interesting stories in this book has to do with Mother's Day, and how filtering through history this holiday has just really been turned on its head from what it was intended to be.
Yes, and it's not I would like to talk about it, but it's important to say that this is very typical of holidays. We tend to look back at the past and think, oh, you know, in those days families were closer. Nonsense. Right up until the 1920s, the most important and emotionally charged holiday in America was the 4th of July, which was a civic holiday. Thanksgiving was very low on the list. Christmas was a time for partying. It was not a time for the family to have all of these expectations, you know, that cause so much stress in modern families when you get together and we're supposed to be so happy. Mother's Day is wonderful because the first proposals for Mother's Day came out of the peace activists and social activists of the 19th century. They were Mother's Day, S' Day, plural. What mothers should do to mobilize against war or to help the community. And it was only in the late 19th century and early 20th century that that began to shift to a celebration of mother in her private role. And as soon as it was adopted in 1914 as a Mother' S Day, its privatized nature and its rejection of its old political and social origins in a woman's movement meant that it was totally vulnerable to manipulation by the advertising industry. And in fact, the woman who had spent her life getting Mother's Day found out within a year that it was being so misused that she spent the rest of her life trying to get it changed and non-commercialized, and that was a much tougher deal. She ended up in an insane asylum. This
is Anna Jarvis, who was the daughter of the woman who actually was credited with starting Mother's Day.
That's
it's really quite a story, and it's interesting because here's this holiday that is an outward turning to the community and to the world and a woman's role in those larger venues. And now Mother's Day, it's turned inward.
Oh yes, the cards. You know, you walk down the hall, this sticky, sweet cotton candy sentiment, and it's all in women's private role. And it totally ignores women's social networks and political activism that inspired the day. It's very ironic.
We've been talking about the American family. Are American families somehow different than families around the world? Or do other countries not have this same kind of mythology that we do?
Well, not entirely, but America's unique in one way. We tend to have a more sentimentalization of family life and less actual policies to aid families than any of our other industrial democracies. Businessmen and politicians from other countries will often tell you in private or in their to their own people, they'll talk about how Americans just go on and on about mother, capital M, and the family, capital T, capital F. And yet, of course, we're the only industrial democracy to lack parental leave policies, to lack a home visitor program for newborn care. We have the highest gap between rich and poor families than anywhere else in the industrial world. So a lot of this rhetoric exists at this tremendously abstract way. Another big difference is that we tend to, again, to substitute family mythology for discussing social and economic structural problems. During the Depression even, people blamed unemployment in America on their lack of manliness, whereas in Europe they blamed it on lack of jobs.
We only have about a minute left, and I wanted to ask you, from having put together this immensely detailed look at American families, if you have any sense of the future directions families are likely to take.
Well, diversity is here to stay. We can either go ahead and beat up on people for refusing to go along with our myth, or we can start adjusting our school schedules, our work policies, and our emotional expectations of family life to the reality of American diversity. And I do see grounds for hope. I find that the American people are far in advance of the politicians on this, as we saw by the rejection of the moralizing of the last campaign.
And that families, they're going to continue to take different forms and look in different ways than if your idea of the family is somehow stuck in the 50s sitcoms look, you're in for a big surprise.
That's right. They're going to get more diverse. Whether they're going to get the support systems they need is an open question, and it's essentially up to us.
Stephanie Coontz, I want to thank you so much for joining us on Upon Reflection to talk about your book, The Way We Never Were, American Families and the Nostalgia Trap.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.